Varan 4. The name alone was enough to make most species shudder. It was a world of untamed chaos. Boiling volcanic fields, storms that could strip metal, and an ecosystem so aggressive that even the hardiest warlike species avoided settling there. The Galactic Council had classified it a Deathworld centuries ago, sealing its fate as a place best left untouched. Yet, despite its terrifying reputation, it had inhabitants. The Varoni were a delicate insectoid race with a deep reverence for knowledge. They had learned, over centuries, how to coexist with their planet's dangers, building cities under reinforced biodomes, threading their civilization carefully between the world's volatile moods. To them, Varan 4 wasn't a death world. It was simply misunderstood. But no one listened. The Deathworld label had doomed their progress. Trade was minimal, diplomacy nearly non-existent. Who would invest in a world where one bad day could wipe out an entire colony? The Varoni elders had petitioned the Galactic Council for decades to remove the classification, arguing that their world was no worse than any other extreme terrain planet. Each time, they were met with the same response. If your planet isn't a death world, prove it. For centuries, no one had tried. Then came the humans. Captain Elias Carter stood before the council chamber, hands clasped behind his back, grinning like a man who had already won the argument. His expedition proposal was short and to the point. Varan 4 is not a death world. Then we'll prove it. Let us go there, live there, work there. If we survive, the classification changes. The councilors scoffed. Arrogant mammals. Humanity had gained a reputation across the stars for being reckless, relentless, and disturbingly hard to kill. They had already settled planets where no sane species dared to set foot, tamed hostile environments through sheer force of will, and turned death traps into home. But Varan 4, that was different. Captain Carter, one of the Varoni elders, chittered nervously, his mandibles clicking in concern. You don't understand. We have spent generations avoiding unnecessary risks. You, humans, you embrace them. Carter chuckled. That's one way of putting it. You will not survive. His grin widened. Wanna bet? And so, despite objections, warnings, and predictions of certain doom, humanity was granted a 6-month trial period. If Carter and his crew could establish a sustainable settlement outside the protected cities, the Galactic Council would be forced to reconsider Varan 4's Deathworld status. No one expected them to last a month. Arrival. Welcome to hell. The moment the human vessel, Endeavor, pierced Varan 4's upper atmosphere, the planet tried to kill them. A violent ion storm surged across the sky, turning day into an eerie twilight of flashing blue lightning. The ship's shields groaned under the strain, alarms blaring as Carter's pilot fought to stabilize their descent. Is it too late to call this a bad idea? Someone muttered over comms. Relax, Carter said, strapping himself in as the ship bucked under the turbulence. We've landed in worse. With a final bone-rattling impact, Endeavor touched down on Varan 4. And the real challenge began. The landing site was a wasteland of jagged obsidian rock, stretching out beneath a sky that churned with angry storm clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the twisted, gnarled trees that somehow survived in this brutal environment. The air smelled of sulfur and something feral, something watching. Captain Elias Carter stepped off the ship's ramp, boots crunching against the blackened earth. A gust of hot wind whipped across the landing zone, carrying dust and the distant echo of something large moving through the wilderness. He took a deep breath, grinning. Smells like home. Behind him, his crew disembarked, some adjusting their breathing masks while others scanned their surroundings. Lieutenant Sarah Voss, his second-in-command, checked her wrist scanner. We're already being watched, she muttered. Carter didn't need the scanner to know that. Predators always sensed new arrivals. A group of Varoni representatives stood a safe distance away, huddled beneath their shimmering protective cloaks. Their exoskeletons clicked as they exchanged nervous glances. One, an elder named Shirel, stepped forward, his antennae twitching. "You have two choices," Gerald said. "You can stay in our city, where it is safe, or you can attempt your settlement." He hesitated on the last word, as if the concept itself was foolish. "If you choose the latter, we will not intervene when nature claims you." Carter smirked. "Appreciate the warning. We'll manage." Gerald's mandibles clicked in frustration. "You do not understand. This world is not a challenge to overcome. It is a force. It does not yield." Carter shrugged. "Neither do we." The Varoni exchanged uneasy looks. Finally, Gerald sighed. "Then you may proceed. May the planet grant you mercy." Carter turned back to his crew. "All right, you heard him. Let's get to work." Into the wild. With the Varoni watching in quiet horror, the humans moved out. Carter's team, a mix of engineers, survivalists, and combat specialists, carried prefabricated structures and modular defenses, determined to claim a piece of Varan 4 as their own. Their destination was a rocky plateau near a freshwater source, a spot the Varoni had deemed too exposed, too dangerous, too close to the hunting grounds of the apex predators. Perfect. The trek was grueling. The terrain constantly shifted under their feet, as if the planet itself was testing their resolve. Enormous thorned vines moved when they weren't looking. The wind carried deep, resonant howls that set every nerve on edge. The ground occasionally rumbled, a subtle reminder that the planet was alive and waiting for them to make a mistake. And yet Carter's team moved forward. Unlike the Varoni, they did not tread lightly. They cut paths, drove stakes into the ground, and scanned for patterns in the chaos. Where the Varoni saw only threats, the humans saw challenges to overcome. By the time the twin suns began to dip below the horizon, they had reached their target site. Carter stood at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the vast, untamed wilds. Behind him, his crew was already setting up defensive barriers, power grids, and sensor arrays. They worked with the precision of a species that had made countless hostile worlds their home. Sarah Voss stepped up beside him, rifle slung over her shoulder. "I give it 20 minutes before something tries to kill us." Carter chuckled. "You're an optimist." And as if the planet had been waiting for those words, a deep, guttural roar echoed across the plateau. Something was coming, and the test had just begun. The roar came again, low and guttural, vibrating through the very ground beneath them. It wasn't a sound meant to intimidate. It was a warning, one that every natural creature on Varan 4 understood. But humans had never been good at listening to warnings. Carter's hand went to his sidearm as his crew froze, eyes scanning the darkening wilderness beyond the plateau. The last rays of the twin suns stretched long shadows across the rocky terrain. The wind carried the stench of blood and wet earth, and something moved beyond the tree line. "Thermal signatures incoming," Voss murmured, checking her wrist scanner. "Large. Fast. Numbers?" Carter asked. 2. No 3. No 5. The first set of eyes appeared in the darkness, glowing, slitted, and watching. Then they charged. The apex predators of Varan 4. The creatures that emerged from the shadows were nightmare-given form. Standing on 4 thick, muscular limbs, their exoskeletons were obsidian black, their bodies covered in jagged, natural armor that gleamed under the fading sunlight. Their heads were long and angular, filled with rows of serrated fangs, and their tails ended in curved, barbed hooks, capable of slicing through flesh and steel alike. Varoni Deathstalkers. The Varoni had built entire civilizations around avoiding these things. They were considered uncontested apex predators, able to topple buildings, tear through metal, and hunt in coordinated packs. The locals had only survived by hiding, by knowing when to flee. Carter had no intention of fleeing. "Defensive positions," he barked, already raising his rifle. The humans didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They didn't run for cover. Instead, they dug in. Plasma rifles snapped up, targeting systems locked on. Heavy auto turrets, only half assembled, were rushed into activation mode, their barrels swinging toward the threat. The first Deathstalker lunged, but before it even hit the ground, a barrage of gunfire tore through its hide. Crack, crack, crack. The beast let out a howling shriek, its charge faltering as armor-piercing rounds slammed into its joints. The second and third creatures didn't stop, leaping toward the nearest humans, claws outstretched. Voss sidestepped one in a blur of motion, planting a detonation charge against its flank before rolling clear. A heartbeat later, boom! The explosion ripped through its armored torso, sending chunks of carapace flying. The third Deathstalker was met mid-air by 24 high-velocity rounds, its body twisting as it crashed to the ground, twitching. The last two hesitated. These creatures were apex hunters, but they were also intelligent. They had never encountered prey that fought back this hard. And then, the turrets activated. With a mechanical whine, the autogun spun up, and the night erupted in firepower. Survival is a choice. By the time the smoke cleared, 5 corpses lay smoldering on the rocky plateau. The last one had tried to flee. It didn't make it. Carter exhaled, lowering his rifle. His ears rang from the gunfire, but his grin was impossible to miss. Voss nudged a body with her boot. So much for uncontested apex predators. Carter chuckled. Guess no one told them about us. From the ridge above, the Varoni delegation had watched the entire battle in absolute horror. Gyral's mandibles quivered as he took a slow step forward. That, he stammered. That was impossible. Carter glanced at him. Nah, it was just Tuesday. The Varoni had spent centuries believing this planet could not be tamed, that no one could survive outside their cities, that their world was, by definition, a death world. Carter turned back to his crew, watching them drag the corpses into a pile for analysis. They were laughing, grinning, already discussing adjustments to their defenses. No fear, no hesitation. Because to humanity, survival was never about running. It was about fighting back. And Varanfor had just learned it the hard way. The corpses of the Deathstalkers were still smoldering when the first warning tremor rippled through the ground. Voss felt it first. She paused mid-sentence, her boot still pressing against the exoskeletal remains of one of the fallen beasts. Did you feel? Then the ground lurched. A deep groaning rumble echoed across the plateau, like the sound of a world waking up angry. The air thickened, electric with tension, as the sky, once a deep violet with scattered twin starlight, shifted. A wall of black clouds was forming on the horizon, rolling forward like an advancing army. Carter didn't hesitate. He keyed his comms. All teams, storm protocols. Now. Varanfor fights back. The Varoni watching from the ridge let out a collective hiss of alarm. Gyral's antennae twitched violently as he took a step forward. You have to retreat. That is a black storm. Carter barely glanced at him as he switched through holo displays, monitoring the sudden spike in atmospheric instability. Yeah. And? Gyral's mandibles clicked in frustration. And that means you are going to die. Black storms on Varanfor were legendary. They weren't just wind and rain. They were an onslaught of destruction. Electromagnetic pulses, acid rain, firestorms ignited by static-charged lightning, and worst of all, the creatures that moved within them. The Varoni had never survived one unscathed. That's why their cities were built underground or shielded beneath massive domes. No one in their right mind would face a storm head-on. Except humans. Voss. Carter barked. Already on it. She was a blur of motion, relaying commands to the crew. Within seconds, the humans mobilized, their settlement in progress transforming. Automated drones deployed storm barriers, reinforced shielding snapped into place, and sensor arrays adjusted for the sudden EM interference that would fry most standard technology. The wind hit next, a wall of force that nearly bowled over the unprepared Varoni watching from the ridge. They had no protection out here. Carter looked up at them, then sighed. Get down here, he shouted over the rising winds, unless you want to be redecorated across the landscape. Gyral hesitated. The pride of his people told him to refuse, but the wind screamed against his exoskeleton like a hunting beast, and the sky burned with forks of emerald lightning. He made the only choice he could. "Move," he commanded, and the Varoni rushed down the slope, scrambling toward the humans' defenses. Survival means adaptation. The storm hit like a vengeful god. Rain fell, not as water, but as scorching chemical droplets that sizzled against the reinforced plating of the human shelters. The wind carried debris the size of boulders, smashing against energy barriers that flickered under the strain but held firm. Then came the creatures. The Varoni had always feared the black storms because they didn't just bring destruction. They'd brought the things that lived within them. Shadow stalkers, storm wraiths, predators adapted to hunt in the absolute maelstrom of chaos. And they were hungry. The first one landed on the outer perimeter, a blur of claws and teeth, shrieking as it tore into steel plating like it was paper. It barely had time to register its mistake before an auto turret unleashed a full payload of incendiary rounds, setting it ablaze. Another lurched through the haze, all serrated limbs and gleaming fangs. A human combat specialist met it head-on, sidestepping a swipe before burying a plasma blade straight through its skull. More came. The humans held. The Varoni, huddled in the reinforced shelter, watched in utter shock. Their entire species had been running from this for centuries. Now, before their eyes, the humans were fighting back and winning. Carter wiped acid rain off his visor, watching as his crew pushed back against the storm, against nature itself. He grinned. Hell of a first day. Aftermath. A new understanding. When the storm finally passed, the plateau was scared but standing. The human structures had taken a beating but had held strong. The crew had some minor injuries, but no casualties. And the Varoni. They had just witnessed the impossible. Gyral stood in the wreckage, staring at the burned corpses of storm creatures and the still-standing human settlement. His mandibles twitched. "This," he whispered, "this cannot be real." Carter clapped him on the back. "Welcome to reality, pal." For the first time in history, a black storm had been faced head-on and survived. The Deathworld wasn't as deadly as the Varoni thought. It had just never met humanity before. The black storm had come and gone, leaving the plateau scarred but standing. The ground was littered with charred remains of storm creatures, the air thick with the stench of burnt exoskeletons and ozone. The human settlement, though battered, still stood. The Varoni couldn't comprehend it. Gyral moved through the aftermath, his clawed feet crunching against scorched rock. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The humans had survived. More than that, they had fought back. His people had spent generations perfecting their avoidance strategies, building underground sanctuaries, reinforcing their belief that survival meant hiding. Yet these humans, with their crude structures and reckless defiance, had stood their ground against nature itself. "This is not possible," he muttered. Carter, standing over the wreckage of a fallen storm beast, overheard him. "Not possible." He kicked at the creature's ruined carcass. "Looks pretty damn possible from where I'm standing." Gyral turned to face him, his mandibles twitching. "You do not understand. The black storms are a force of the planet itself. We do not fight them. We endure them." Carter gave a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, we don't do endure. We do overcome. The Deathworld is watching." As the last wisps of storm clouds faded, the planet grew silent. Too silent. Voss, always one to notice when things were off, frowned at her scanner. "Something's weird." Carter arched a brow. "Weird how?" She gestured at the wreckage around them. "We fought off a storm, killed a bunch of apex predators, and made it through without a single casualty." That should have drawn attention. Carter understood what she meant. In every ecosystem, there was always something bigger, something watching. And this world had been watching them. Gyral's antennae twitched. He could feel it too. Something beneath the surface of the world had taken notice. Then the ground rumbled. Not like before, not a passing tremor, not the shifting of unstable terrain. This was different. It was deliberate. The apex of the apex. A new sound filled the air, a deep, resonant vibration, like the distant call of a leviathan. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was something older, something that commanded the land itself. The humans turned toward the distant cliffs, weapons raised, tension thick enough to choke on. Even the Varoni froze, their exoskeletons shivering with instinctual fear. Something massive was moving beyond the ridge. Something that had never needed to reveal itself before, because nothing had ever been a threat to it. Until now. Carter's grip on his rifle tightened. "Looks like we finally got its attention," he muttered. Voss exhaled. Well, that was fast. Gyral could barely whisper. The World Breaker. For centuries, the Varoni had spoken of it in whispers. The apex of all predators, the one that had no natural enemies, no need to hunt because all things feared it before they even saw it. And now, because of the humans, because of their defiance, their survival, their refusal to yield, the World Breaker was coming. And this time, the Deathworld itself was watching. The ground shuddered as something colossal moved beyond the ridge. Dust and loose rock cascaded down the cliffs, and the air vibrated with a deep, almost inhuman resonance, a sound so ancient it felt like it had always existed. Then it stepped into view. The World Breaker. Carter had seen some terrifying things in his life. Void serpents, war mechs, black hole anomalies. But nothing compared to this. It stood over 30 meters tall, a mountain of muscle and exoskeletal plating that looked grown, not built. Its 4 legs, thick as tree trunks, dug into the rock with razor-sharp talons that cracked the stone beneath them. Its torso was layered with overlapping chitin, gleaming in the fading twin sunlight, with scars that told stories of past battles, ones it had clearly won. Its head was the worst part. A jagged, almost crown-like structure of bone encircled its skull, and beneath it, rows upon rows of black, soulless eyes. It had no need for intimidation tactics. It was the top of the food chain, and it knew it. And then it roared. The sound was not just noise, it was power. A low-frequency shockwave that physically slammed into the humans, rattling their bones, and making the Varoni collapse in sheer terror. Gyral fell to his knees, his exoskeleton shaking uncontrollably. We are dead." His voice barely made it above a whisper. Carter, still standing, checked his rifle's charge. Not yet. The test of dominance. Voss cursed as her targeting scanner glitched, the EM field around the creature interfering with their systems. "We can't get a lock. It's messing with our tech." "Figures," Carter muttered. "All right, old school it is." The World Breaker took another step forward. It wasn't charging. It wasn't rushing in for the kill. It was testing them. That was the part that made Carter's blood run cold. It had seen what they had done to the Deathstalkers. It had felt the storm's aftermath. And now it wasn't attacking blindly. It was waiting to see if these new creatures, these humans, were worth its attention. And Carter was going to give it an answer. He switched to open comms. "All units, heavy weapons. We hit it with everything we've got." Voss grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The first strike. The humans didn't panic. They didn't run. They fought. Within seconds, the plateau exploded with firepower. Railgun turrets spun up, their barrels humming with energy before unleashing hypervelocity slugs that slammed into the World Breaker's armored hide. Plasma mortars arched through the air, leaking trails of burning light before they detonated against its thick exoskeleton. For the first time in centuries, something dared to challenge it. The first impact made it stagger. The second one made it roar. But it didn't fall. Instead, the World Breaker lowered its head and charged. The shockwave from its movement sent boulders flying, and when it impacted the first line of defenses, the force ripped through steel plating like paper. Carter barely had time to roll clear before a massive talon slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. Dust and debris blinded the air, and for a moment, all he could hear was the roaring of the beast and the frantic shouts of his crew. Then Voss's voice crackled in over comms. "We're gonna need a bigger gun." Carter grinned through the chaos. "Way ahead of you." He turned toward the base, where the prototype weapon sat, one they hadn't even finished testing yet. If the World Breaker wanted to see if humans were worthy opponents, then it was about to get its answer. The World Breaker charged, and the plateau shattered beneath its weight. A single stride from the beast annihilated what remained of the outer defenses. Steel plating crumpled like tin foil, energy barriers collapsed under the sheer force, and one of the humans' railgun turrets was ripped from its foundations and flung into the distance. The Varoni had never seen anything like it, and yet the human stood. Carter sprinted toward the base, his boots kicking up dust and debris, dodging another titanic impact as one of the creature's limbs smashed into the ground nearby. "Voss," he barked into comms. "Status on the prototype. Online in 30 seconds, assuming we don't get crushed first. Then buy us time." Defying the apex, the humans were already ahead of him. Voss and her fire teams had repositioned, using the uneven terrain as cover, laying coordinated suppressing fire on the monster's joints, eyes, and exposed membranes between its armored plates. Grenade launchers thumped, sending shockwave explosives detonating across the World Breaker's hide, sending chunks of organic plating flying. Incendiary rounds ignited, clinging to its flesh, burning bright against the darkened sky. The World Breaker let out an earth-shaking bellow, its massive head whipping toward the attackers. It had faced storms, rival apex predators, and the merciless conditions of Varanfor for centuries. But it had never faced humans. It swiped its massive claw across the battlefield. Voss and her squad barely had time to react. 1 second, they were standing, firing. Then the ground was gone beneath them. A blast of raw kinetic force tore through their ranks, sending several soldiers flying. Some hit the ground, rolling painfully, others weren't so lucky. Voss gritted her teeth, pulling herself up from the rubble of a collapsed barricade. Her HUD flashed injury reports, but she ignored them. They weren't dead. That meant they could still fight. She raised her plasma rifle and fired right into the beast's exposed eye cluster. The shot landed. The World Breaker reared back, letting out a deafening, alien roar of pain. Carter saw the opening. "That's it. Keep it focused on you." "Gee, thanks, sir," Voss called back, ducking behind a jagged rock formation as the creature blindly swung at her position. The last shot. Carter reached the base's inner platform, where the prototype weapon was finally online. The Thor 9 Judgment Cannon, a classified, experimental railgun, designed to punch through capital ships, and now it was aimed at the biggest, meanest thing this planet had to offer. The charge-up sequence hummed through the air, a deep, resonating power that made Carter's bones vibrate. "Target locked," the weapons officer shouted. "Fire," Carter roared. The sky split apart. A lance of pure kinetic force, a tungsten round accelerated to near-orbital velocities, tore through the World Breaker's torso, from chest to back, in a fraction of a second. For a moment, the battlefield froze. Then, the World Breaker staggered, a creature that had never known true pain, that had never faced anything stronger than itself, let out a sound that was not rage. It was shock. It collapsed to its knees, struggling, confused. Its blood, a dark, viscous substance, poured onto the shattered earth. Carter stepped forward, eyes locked on the beast. He didn't look away. He needed it to see what had just happened. And then, with a final rumbling breath, the World Breaker fell. A new order. Silence. The humans had won. Gyral, who had been frozen in stunned terror, fell to his knees, His mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed. His people had called this creature the embodiment of the planet's will, a force that could never be challenged. But the humans, they had defied the Deathworld itself, and won. Carter exhaled, looking around at his team. They were battered, bruised, but alive. He turned back to Gyril, who was still staring at him in sheer disbelief. Lesson 1, Carter said, wiping blood and dirt from his face. Fear is a choice. The Deathworld had a new ruler now, and its name was humanity. The Worldbreaker lay still. A creature that had once ruled unchallenged over Varanfor had met its end, not to a storm, not to starvation, not to time, but to something the planet had never known before. Humanity. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind carried the acrid scent of burnt chitin and scorched earth. Smoke still curled from the massive hole in the beast's torso, where the Thor 9 railgun had torn through the unbreakable. Gyril felt lightheaded, his exoskeleton still rattling from the sheer impossibility of what had just occurred. The Worldbreaker had been part of the planet's legend, a force of nature itself, something no species could ever challenge. And yet, the humans had done the impossible. Carter stepped forward, staring at the fallen behemoth, his rifle still clutched in his hands. He took in the gargantuan corpse, the black ichor pooling beneath it, and the stillness of a world that had just lost its apex predator. Then he turned to the Varoni survivors. They were still frozen, their antennae twitching, their bodies stiff with an instinctual fear that had been ingrained into their DNA for millennia. He exhaled and spoke. The Deathworld knows our name. You see now, Carter said, his voice calm but firm. You don't have to live in fear of this place. Gyril's mandibles clicked involuntarily. You do not understand. The Worldbreaker was not just a predator. It was a symbol. It was the balance. It was the will of the planet itself. Carter's gaze didn't waver. Then consider this. He gestured toward the fallen Titan. The balance just changed. A murmur rippled through the Varoni. Some still looked at the humans with awe, others with disbelief, but none could deny what had just happened. For centuries, they had hid from the storms, from the predators, from the very world they called home. They had believed that to survive, one must submit. But now, for the first time, they had seen another way. A way where one did not endure a Deathworld. A way where one could conquer it. A new era begins. The ground trembled, but this time it was not from a predator's approach. It was something else. The planet itself was adjusting. The storm clouds that had threatened the horizon began to shift, their chaotic swirls breaking apart, as if some unseen force had been disrupted. The air felt lighter, as if the very world had taken a deep breath. For eons, Varanfor had been a planet of unyielding brutality, a world where only the strongest creatures dictated the rules. And now, it had acknowledged something new. The humans had forced it to listen. Gyril's claws curled into the dirt. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about hiding. He was thinking about what came next. Humanity's legacy. Voss limped toward Carter, a smirk on her bruised face. Well, that was fun. Carter snorted. Fun's one word for it. Think we'll get hazard pay? Carter laughed. A genuine, exhausted laugh. If not, I'm putting in a complaint with HQ. The surviving humans gathered, battered but victorious, standing atop the corpse of a legend. Gyril hesitated, then stepped forward. His people watched him, waiting. For once, he didn't hesitate. He turned to Carter and spoke the words that no Varoni had ever said before. Teach us. Carter blinked. Teach you what? Gyril looked at the human settlement, scared but standing. At the bodies of his own people, shaken but no longer hiding. At the humans themselves, survivors, warriors, conquerors. He took a deep breath and made his choice. Teach us how to be like you. Carter smiled. Now that, he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder, I can do. The Deathworld is ours now. For the first time in history, Varan 4 was no longer a place to fear. It was a world to be claimed, and humanity had just taken the first step toward rewriting its future.